November the 29th, the second last day of November. I can hear jingle bells just around the corner. Is that a bird I'm hearing? Well, oil prices bouncing up this morning in Asia after a pretty significant sell-off yesterday and through November, nonetheless, just reversing as they were about to knock on the door of $80 on Brent yesterday. There was the bounce back, the noise that OPEC Plus would indeed look to take further action next week, as was sort of indicated in our discussions earlier this week, that a proactive Saudi energy minister isn't going to put his claws away now when things are getting serious. Let's go to Rustin Edwards. Good morning, Rustin, head of fuel oil procurement at Euronav. Rustin, your thoughts on the direction of travel going into the end of November? Is $80 oil, Brent, something that OPEC Plus should be concerned about?
Well, I think OPEC Plus has to be really concerned about the general economic health of the world, because if you don't have good economic growth, you don't really have demand for oil. That being said, they're being far more proactive than they've ever been in the past with the month-on-month or meeting every 2 months. So it gives them a lot more of a toolbox to work with than they used to have when they only had meetings every 6 months. So they can be far more reactive. If I said before, they're still underproducing versus their quota. And I think most of the world accepts that. So when is a cut not a cut? I mean, if they cut another 2 million barrels from production, they're still behind in their quota, I think, by about 800,000 barrels a day. Because I think the most recent numbers I saw that they're still underproducing by about 3.2 million versus the current quota levels. And so if you're still underproducing by that much, cutting your quota back will only impact the exports from certain countries, but not from the entire group. And that still leaves headroom for other countries to catch up and keep supplies at a well-supplied level. I mean, I think we saw this already with the last cut. You've had stabilization of Libya, you've had Nigeria flows come back on with Forcados and with Bunga fields coming back online. Kazakhstan has also come back online fully. And so basically negating the reduction in supplies from both UAE and Saudi Arabia, making the cut kind of a non-issue.
Well, certainly the oil price would indicate that it's somewhat of not a major issue for the markets, given the decline through the month of November. Let's go to David Rundell. Sorry, do you want to say something there, Justin?
I think a telling thing was back when the Wall Street Journal published their article that OPEC was going to add 500,000 barrels to the market, and the market nosedove, and the structure in the crude market collapsed. To say that the market is that tight and 500,000 barrels flips you from a dollar backwardation to contango, it tells you that the market is not as tight as people want to report.
Clearly, and I suspect somewhere in that conversation of that 500,000 barrels, I still of the view that somehow there was a miscommunication, that it was maybe language or accent or something went awry in that journalist interviewee conversation, because it was just so out of context, that idea. But David Rundell, former chief of mission, American Embassy in Riyadh, and author of Vision or Mirage, Saudi Arabia at the Crossroads. Before we get into your expertise on all things Saudi and the Gulf, David, I want to get into your expertise on the shale oil production in the US, where you are a vested actor, and just stay on this theme of supply that Rustin kicked us off with. Are we seeing finally supply recovery in the shale patch as we come to the end of this year, in which Brent has averaged $100 a barrel, but yet US oil production is still way behind its pre-COVID level?
The first thing I would say is I'm not sure that, when you say it's way below COVID levels, pre-COVID levels, if you look at the production,
million barrels or so.
If you look at the production in the United States today, it is above every year except I think it's 2019. So it's above what it was for really ever before, except for the 1 year, but right before COVID. So it has come back, and it is at a relatively high level compared to what it was, 5 years ago. So that's point number one, that it, come back not quite to where it was, but come back to a much higher base than we had previously seen. Second point is that what I see in the Permian Basin right now, right today, is that it is hard to get frac crews. It's hard to get drilling rigs. It's hard to get drill pipe. Just speaking from my personal experience right now, you have to wait. You have to wait. You got to get in line. You want, it's not, it's a cyclical industry. And there are times when you have to go to McDonald's and hire a burger flipper to be a roughneck, because there's not enough people around. And we're not quite that bad. And that's a bad place. You don't want to be there because burger flippers wreck your well. But the truth is that it's a cyclical industry, and there are times when there are people out there looking for work. And there are times when it's very hard to find crews. And right now it's hard. There's a waiting list. So I think it's fair to say that the majors and some of the large independents have readjusted their business model. The majors have been affected by this environmental movement, when they have now begun to question whether or not it's going to be a long-term interest that they want to invest in the United States. And the large independents have seen their business model change a bit, in that they have been told that they need to give back more money to their investors. And that's true of the majors as well. So for those people, I think what I see and read is that there is less investment on their part. But from small independents like myself, there certainly doesn't seem to be any slowing down.
To just join the queue for the supply chain.
Yeah, exactly.
Jose Chalhoub, political risk and oil analyst in Venezuela. Given the news that's happened in Venezuela over the last week regarding Chevron getting a license to export, tell us a little bit about that. And should OPEC Plus now be putting Venezuela new supply under its consideration as it meets next week for output in the first quarter of next year?
Thank you, Sean. Thank you very much. Well, certainly I remain pessimistic ever since we started talking and I started being invited by you to your program. I mean, it's not realistic to consider any ramping up of new production by Chevron, because that's what this new license says, or allows Chevron to start new production from Venezuela and to export it to the US. So that this is why I believe that, if we take a look at this whole year production, by Venezuela, it hasn't been able to recover. And the highest peak of any month during this year has been, 20,000 barrels per day or even less, we have seen drops of production as well. So I don't see that the OPEC Plus should worry or should consider about any significant ramping up of production from Venezuela, unless a significant amount of money is invested by Chevron, because that's going to be a critical issue for Chevron and the Venezuelan government, because the license also says or prohibits any payments of royalties or dividends to the government of Maduro. And just about 2 or 3 hours ago, news came out that the Venezuelan government is not going to allow to, to come out empty-handed about this new license by the Biden administration. So I don't consider that any significant. Not for the third trimester of the next year.
So this is not a game changer moment. This is
not. I don't see it that way.
Rustin, looking at we talked a bit through the supply there regarding OPEC Plus, the shale patch, Venezuela, the looking now towards demand destruction. Of course, the big story that was traumatizing markets yesterday, with the Dow Jones dropping 500 points, oil prices dropping quite a lot, was the news out of China the protests, the sort of frustrations with the COVID lockdown there. Your outlook for that? We did a survey question yesterday asking whether actually this could end up being bullish because it may signal a quicker end to the COVID lockdowns. Your thoughts? You're on mute, Justin.
That will never get old. You're on
Yeah,
mute.
I know.
I think honestly that, the way that the market's been reacting currently, we've seen a pullback in tanker freight rates, mainly I think based on the fact that Chinese demand is not as strong as people have. You have the headline out of ADNOC cutting 5% into China. There was a headline earlier where China was canceling some of their term agreements for December, January because they just don't have the internal demand. Rystad was reporting that traffic flow in Shanghai has not really changed much with all the lockdowns. So net, what is the actual change in demand? I don't think there's any real change in demand in China. Lockdown, no lockdown. There might be perceived change because markets will react saying, oh, it's very bullish now that China can now move freely and do whatever they want. But nevertheless, China is suffering from the same economic conundrum that I think the rest of the world is. I mean, China is not their economy is maturing to a point where they need to do something other than trying to just buy commodities to stimulate internal and infrastructure growth to help make their GDP look better than it really is. They actually need to mature their economy internally. So there may not be the pickup in large force demand that everybody's anticipating once China's zero COVID comes into play. I don't think China is the savior of the world at this point.
Clearly not.
I'd have to just say, I think that's absolutely right, that the slowdown of the Chinese economy is something that has been very predictable for some time. That, you looked at these graphs that people used to put out, and China's growth is 8%. And if it goes on forever, China will own 100% of the world. Well, those extrapolations were always unrealistic. And at some point, China's growth would slow down. And that's what's happening now. And whether COVID ends tonight or next year, China's growth is not going to be 11% or 8% or probably even 7% going forward. So when you look at the oil price surge that really began at the beginning of this century, really around 2001, 2002, that was driven by the explosive growth in China. That's not going to happen again. And who knows, maybe India or someplace else will pick up the slack, but it's not going to be China.
So should, David, then Saudi Arabia and OPEC plus, or Gulf OPEC as we call it, be adjusting their calibration that we may have reached peak oil demand China? Because obviously the Gulf and OPEC, putting aside the plus side, but ultimately OPEC has built its house on incremental growth out of China for the last 20 years.
I think there will be incremental growth globally for the next 20 years, regardless of any effort to transition away from hydrocarbons in Europe and the United States. I think if you look at India and Africa, there's still a lot of scope for growth in those places. So I think that OPEC, Gulf OPEC, whatever you want to call it, will continue to still be called upon to produce at least as much oil as they're producing today. And I think Saudi Aramco has stated that they're going to actually increase production over the next couple of years, and production capability, I should say capacity. And I don't think they would be making that kind of an investment if they didn't agree with what I just said, that global demand is going to grow. Now, what you say about what they're going to do next week, that's a whole different story. I think.
Yeah, well, next week is clearly a decision that is one. I mean, we've seen the signals as we saw running into the last OPEC plus meeting as oil prices were dropping below 90. We had the OPEC plus machine come into action to stop it and reverse it. And once again, the noises over the next few days will be telling on that point. Jose, I wanted to go down to South America because since we last had a chance to talk, of course, we had a result in the Brazilian elections with the re-election of Lula, and I wanted to get your outlook for that, what that means for Brazil, what it means for the industry, and for the wider region.
Yeah, well, recently the President Bolsonaro announced that he will, I mean, he would not recognize the results. The National Tribunal annulled his request to cancel around 250,000 votes. I mean, I see the situation in Brazil, the political situation in Brazil, still delicate, still critical. Lula will assume in January his office, his power, but I still see a country divided. The results were tremendously tight. I mean, the differences were around 1% between both candidates. So it'll be a tremendously difficult moment for Brazil, for Petrobras, and for the region, because Brazil is a superpower in the region. And as long as the political situation is not solved completely and it's not clear, we might be headed towards a political turmoil in Brazil that could reverberate throughout the region.
Wow. Let's think about that. That's a pretty unexpected answer, but nonetheless, there is a Trump in Bolsonaro, and there's no doubt about that. Rustin, the other big event to happen next week is the arrival of the European oil embargo on Russian marine exports. But also we were expecting the oil price cap to come into play as well, that coming out of the US and by the G7. It seems that we've had a failure to arrive at agreement on the price cap, which is at least the reporting, and yet we have this embargo coming in on December 5th. Your thoughts on how those two things are going to land next week?
Well, I mean, I think there is a fairly wide gap on the price cap idea. First off, you've got Poland pushing for a punitive measure around $30 a barrel. You've got the maritime states in the EU pushing for $70 a barrel, and you've got other people looking for a middle road between $60 and $65 a barrel. Nevertheless, the price cap in itself is a hard thing to really make work, because if you look at the framework of the rules that have been pushed out by OFAC on how the price cap is going to work, there's a lot of gaps that can be taken advantage of to make sure the Russian oil flows, which inevitably that is the whole rationale behind the price cap, is to ensure Russian supplies continue going into the market without much of a problem. So I don't think there's going to be much. I think there are enough ships currently that have been, let's say, available that from marginal flag states or from operators outside of the EU, or ownership outside of the EU, that the Russian oil flow is going to move. There's probably going to be some logistical hurdles that have to be overcome, but I think that's going to account for maybe a 500,000 barrel a day drop in Russian exports.
So even with the removal of what is a kind of a European dominated insurance industry, that shipping will continue to move without the cover as provided by the typical actors of Lloyd's of London and so on.
Iran moves oil every day. So does Venezuela, and they're outside those scopes as well. There is capacity in the world to move oil and ensure oil flow outside of the EU and the UK dominated scheme. They are 90%. That means there's another 10% out there. Now, does that 10% grow to 15, 20% because governments back up new funds that are built maybe in Hong Kong, maybe in Dubai to help cover this flow? Most likely. There's a lot of money to be made from people, and they're going to try to exercise that as much as they can. So I don't think there'll be any problem in getting that coverage. The one thing that the price cap does help, though, it does give Russia an out. As much as Russia says, oh, we will not trade with a country that's engaged in the price cap or a trader who's engaged in the price cap, because the nature of the price cap is a non-declarative action, i.e. I go load a cargo, and from what I read the OFAC notes, you do not have to declare anything that I'm loading price cap oil. You as the buyer of that oil just have to retain documentation showing that you did do it under the price cap. So there is no way for people to recognize who's trading price cap and who's not trading price cap. Russia sells everything on an FOB basis, so as long as the oil is moving out, they're happy.
I wanted David to get your expertise on the region here in the Gulf regarding events in Iran. Obviously now 2 months of what seem to be continuous, sustained, serious protests against what was triggered by the murder of the young Iranian girl. Your thoughts on the scale of it? It seems on occasion that it's being quantified as being a very significant challenge to the regime, greater than all the others previous. Your thoughts on how significant a moment this may be, and what the region as a whole should be adjusting for?
Okay, let me just comment real quickly on what Rustin said
Please.
About the price cap.
Yeah.
First of all, I don't think price caps in general, price controls of any kind, wage and price controls generally have not had a happy history throughout modern times. The more significant impact of this is, and this is a term I've heard now used in Saudi Arabia quite frequently, is what they're referring to as financial imperialism. And this means that the abuse of the financial system by the West, of the reserve currency status of the dollar, of the SWIFT system. These are pushing people away from the dollar. These are pushing people away from the London Metal Exchange. These are pushing people away from Lloyd's. The idea that there could never be alternatives to any of these, I think is naive. And so I think that if you really want to look at the long-term implications of this, you're going to see a lot of people working hard to extricate themselves from this control that the West has exerted over the international financial system. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not arguing, but I'm just saying I think that's what you're going to see.
And that is a train that has already been triggered, perhaps, when there's been wind in the sails of that move away from the dollar for some time now, and it was obviously received a lot of oxygen when the dollar deposits of the Russian government were frozen at the early part of this conflict, amongst other events. But I'm quite keen to get on to the Iran question and your thoughts.
Well, okay, I agree with you. So I'll leave that and move on to Iran. I do not believe that the current demonstrations will lead to the overthrow of the Iranian regime. I believe that totalitarian regimes such as the Iranian regime are ruthless and able to suppress dissent. I remind people frequently that Joseph Stalin died in his bed. It took a foreign army to remove Saddam Hussein. It took a massive invasion to get rid of Hitler. When you have a totalitarian regime, it's unlikely that street protests are going to overthrow them. I think you've just seen a good example of that in China. They shut that down real quick, as they did in Hong Kong. So why did the Shah of Iran collapse? The Shah of Iran collapsed because he wasn't willing to shoot people in the street, because his army wasn't willing to shoot people in the street, because the United States sent a general and told him not to shoot people in the streets and said, if you do, we aren't going to support you. So the Shah said, fine, I'm out of here. I don't think the current Iranian regime cares what the United States says about whether or not they shoot people in the streets. And they have a Revolutionary Guard who are, in fact, riding a tiger and know very well that if they get off that tiger, it will devour them. So the Revolutionary Guard are quite happy to shoot people in the streets. I'm not trying to be ruthless or bloody-minded here. I'm just telling you, I think what the facts are, that I don't think the Iranian regime is going anywhere at the current time. What I'm really more concerned about is whether or not they try to create some kind of a diversion by being provocative in the larger Middle East. That I think is a possibility, that they could attempt to unite their people in some kind of a conflict and to see that they're being threatened by the West or Israel or somewhere. And I think
Well,
that's a
certainly
possibility.
that possibility is triggered by the other reality of whatever the uprising, the protests in Iran are what they amount to, what they could amount to, as you've just articulated, not sufficient to topple the regime, but nonetheless sufficient to essentially put the death knell on the JCPOA renewal. And with the death knell of the JCPOA renewal, we're left in this stalemate of Iran having a bigger separation from the US and the European position, and the likelihood of migrating more closer and closer to a nuclear capability. How do we circle that square? Where does that go to? Is the absence of JCPOA renewal talks status quo, or is it an erosion to something darker?
I think it's an erosion to something darker. I think that the arrival of Mr. Netanyahu back in power, he's made it very clear that he's not going to tolerate a nuclear Iran. He's not looking for a compromise. If you're an Iranian and you see Netanyahu back in office and you know that he's not going to tolerate your nuclear development, do you have some kind of a preemptive strike against Israel? Does Israel have some kind of a preemptive strike against Iran? I think that tinderbox has grown drier and more volatile. And I don't want to be a fear monger or an extremist, but I do, and I'm not saying this is going to happen, but I think if you're thinking about how the world goes, you're looking to some extent at a Sarajevo moment here. And what do I mean by that? Despite the rather incoherent news that we hear about Ukraine, I believe that the Russians are likely to very quickly begin an offensive, which will prove overwhelming to the Ukrainians. I expect, and I've said before, that I expect that by the summer, the Russians will have taken back Kherson and Kharkov, and quite likely Odessa.
With the help of Iranian technology.
With the help of Iranian technology. And that as this offensive unfolds, there will be loud voices in the West calling for a doubling and a tripling of Western aid. And you're already beginning to hear this. You're already beginning to hear people talk about boots on the ground, the coalition of the willing. So there's a potential for this thing to escalate. And rather than let Ukraine get defeated, there's a potential that I hope it doesn't come to pass, but there are people who would like to see us double down on this war. So you've got this problem in Ukraine, and then you have the potential of a problem in Iran versus Israel. And what happens if there is a war between Iran and Israel and the United States gets involved and Russia says, well, those are our friends and we're gonna go back the Iranians. And you're already fighting the Russians in the Ukraine indirectly. So this is a Sarajevo moment where, you know, all of a sudden one archduke gets killed in Serbia or where not Serbia, whatever.
Sarajevo, Bosnia.
Sarajevo, yeah, Bosnia. And he gets killed by a Serb in Bosnia. And Austrians say, well, we're going to invade Serbia. And the Russians say, no, you're not. And then the Germans say, well, we're going to help the Austrians. And pretty soon you have a war that nobody really expected. So I see
all of these.
I see these pieces. I see these piles. This tinderbox more volatile than I would like to see, and I think the time is past really to begin to calm this thing down.
Yeah, it does seem. The reason I bring it up is that I don't think with the distraction of everything else, the failure of the JCPOA is not getting enough consideration as to the consequence, as to status quo just doesn't remain status quo, things erode. We have to look to get to the end of this program, unfortunately, and I wanted to get in our survey question and the outlook. Do you expect OPEC Plus to make deeper cuts when they meet next week? Yes or no? why would they stop doing what they've been doing now? Jose, quickly, I wanted to get your thoughts. You suggested earlier nothing to look at here in Venezuela change, but are you seeing some postural change from Washington to compromise a bit more on meeting Maduro's some of his needs in order to get a bigger deal done here?
Well, this was a first move I see by the Biden administration, since there's a negotiation ongoing in Mexico between the government and the opposition. So far, there hasn't been any significant results or outcomes from those negotiations. So for the Biden administration, I mean, I see that the Washington through the first, his first offer. But it will much depend on the political dynamic of going on in Mexico, what further concessions the Maduro government will make, if there's going to be any free or fair elections in 2024, which I see unlikely. There's going to be 2 simultaneous elections in the US and Venezuela in 2024. So, okay, you see Chevron right now restarting production in Venezuela, but what happens if there's any Republican coming to Washington in 2024? There's the likelihood that those measures will be reversed. So, I mean, it's uncertain, and I don't see any significant outcome, coming from
no
Venezuela.
quantities of oil coming anytime soon from Venezuela. Rustin, last word to you. I wanted to get an update on all things tanker rates. One of the things we've seen, whether price cap or no price cap, the reality is that tankers moving from Europe, Russian Baltics, all the way to China and places that they never did before, spending months on the sea rather than short journeys back and forward to Europe. And now we're seeing the first Australian LNG tanker into Europe just landed in the last few days. I'm wondering, what is the outlook there, do you think, on tankers and these new flows?
Well, I mean, I think these new flows will be solidified, much to what David was saying, that, if you start losing the hegemony around the US dollar and the financial controls, you start diverting the markets into 2 different sides of are you for or against US dollar? That means longer ton miles in general. But the long ton miles are going to be there for a while. Tanker rates have been exceeding $100,000 a day on time charter equivalent rates, especially for VLCCs and Suezmaxes. Now that's pulled back here in the recent last 6 or 7 days as the Chinese COVID cases have increased and they have cut their demand from the market. Therefore, tanker rates have dropped off, but they're still at very nice rates, $75,000, $80,000 a day. So, happy days for the tanker owner.
And your indication is that that's likely to last higher for longer, whatever.
It will probably last because there's no new ship builds coming in. A lot of ships going older, and as ships move out of the clean fleet into this dirty fleet, there are some ramifications going with the ship owner. Now, if you look at all things freight, though, container freight and dry bulk freight have dropped off a cliff. And that looks like that's going to be there for a while as consumer demand's not there to drive the container freight markets. And so without the container freight or the consumer driving goods coming out of China on the containers, keeping rates higher, it just shows you that we are going into a major economic slowdown that is going to impact that dry bulk side of the coin for a while.
Well, we're going to have to wrap it up there. All of these things that OPEC Plus are going to have to consider next week, according to our poll that we're going to post on social now, by a little bit, yes, the expectation is growing of deeper cuts out of OPEC Plus, which you would imagine will continue to be supportive of oil prices, at least until their decision is announced over the next few trading sessions. And we didn't even get to talk about rail strikes in the United States and the Congress actually intervening to stop it, which is in itself a pretty big story. And we'll have to deal with that on another day.
It's a time-honored tradition in the United States.
Sorry?
That's a time-honored tradition for the U.S. Congress to intervene in a rail strike.
It seems very 19th century, but we're always reminded that so much has changed and yet so little has changed at the same time. So that's a kind of interesting thing to ponder. We'll wrap it up there with oil prices, as we started out saying, trading higher this morning, recovering with the expectation of an OPEC plus cut. At least that's the trend at the moment. Is it a dead cat bounce for this trend line that has been very aggressively downward over the last month? We'll have to wait and see. Thank you so much, David Rundell, for your insights today. Rustin Edwards and Jose Chalhoub. If we don't get to talk to you again, happy holidays and look forward to all of your engagement in the new year. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Take care.
Cheers.